Karen had been biting at the edges for years, but now she had sunk her teeth in deep. The air carried the weight of an impending storm, thick with the scent of damp earth, as if the land itself was holding its breath for what was coming. Ezra Ndlovu jolted awake, his heart pounding against his ribs. The room was bathed in the soft glow of dawn, but something felt off, deleted. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, rubbing his face as he tried to shake off the unease. Then he remembered. Karen. The HOA had been tightening its grip for months, but yesterday's notice was different. This time, they weren't just issuing another petty fine, they were coming for his home, his family's land. This land had carried the footsteps of his ancestors, their sweat, their triumphs, and their pain. It was more than just property. It was legacy. And now, an outsider had decided it no longer belonged to them. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. Ezra stood up, crossing the room with deliberate steps. As he pulled open the curtains, his stomach clenched. A white envelope was nailed to his front door. The HOA letterhead glared back at him like a warning shot across the bow. His chest tightened as he approached, the paper flapping slightly in the evening breeze. His fingers trembled as he tore it free, his breath coming shallow as he read the words that would change everything. Ezra's vision blurred with rage. Non-compliant landscaping? His grandfather had planted these trees with his own hands, long before the neighborhood had even existed. Unauthorized modifications? The home had stood untouched for over a century, a testament to his family's perseverance and unyielding spirit. Restricted art? The mural on the outer wall wasn't just decoration, it was a tribute to his ancestors, a symbol of resilience that had withstood colonial rule, apartheid, and the passage of time. And now some entitled HOA Karen wanted it gone. Not because it was unsightly, not because it broke any real rule, but because it didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. Because it was a reminder that families like Ezra's had roots here, that they belonged just as much, if not more, than she ever did. His grip tightened around the letter, the paper crumpling under the force of his rage. His family had built this land with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They had endured and thrived despite every effort to erase them, and he'd be damned if he let anyone take it from them now. This wasn't just a violation notice. This wasn't just a fine. This was an attack, a targeted assault against everything his family had worked for. This was war, and Karen had just fired the first shot. Before we dive into the full scale of this racist HOA nightmare, I need to ask for a small favor. But trust me, it's more important than you think. People like Karen operate in the shadows, manipulating the system and using power and intimidation to erase history and displace families. But the only way we fight back is by making sure stories like this reach as many people as possible. Drop a comment with the country you're watching from. Let's show Karen that this is bigger than just one family. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. This battle isn't just about Ezra. It's about every black homeowner who has ever been threatened, manipulated, or forced out of their land by those who think they can rewrite history. Now let's get into it. Ezra stormed back into the house, his pulse hammering in his ears as he slammed the letter onto the worn wooden table. The impact sent a ripple through the clutter of bills and unopened envelopes that had begun to accumulate, a physical representation of the storm brewing around them. Layla, his younger sister, looked up from her laptop, her dark eyes narrowing as she took in his rigid posture and the barely restrained fury on his face. "Another one?" she asked, her voice cautious but laced with the kind of weariness that only came from fighting the same battle over and over again. Ezra exhaled sharply through his nose, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Not just another one," he said, his voice tight with frustration, the words feeling like gravel against his throat. He turned the envelope over, the HOA's insignia stamped in the upper left corner like a brand, a constant reminder of their suffocating grip. "They're threatening to take the house, Layla." Layla's fingers curled into fists, her knuckles turning white. "They can't do that! They have no right!" A bitter laugh escaped Ezra's lips as he collapsed into a chair, rubbing his temples. "They don't need a right," he muttered, shaking his head. "They just need enough leverage, enough pressure, And enough time to make us give up. Give up. The words left a sour taste in his mouth. That's what they wanted, wasn't it? For him to roll over, surrender, pack up, and leave so they could have their perfect little neighborhood free of families like his. But he wouldn't. Karen McNeil had made herself infamous in the neighborhood, a woman whose smile was as sharp as a dagger. She didn't just run the HOA, she controlled it, wielding it like a personal kingdom. The bylaws bent to her whims, the rules changing just enough to target certain families, the ones she deemed unworthy, the ones who didn't fit her version of an ideal community. Ezra and Layla's family had been in her crosshairs from the moment they moved in. First, it was the passive-aggressive letters about their lawn being unacceptably wild, even though half the homes on the block had yards in worse condition. Then, it was the arbitrary fines for minor violations. A garbage bin left out 10 minutes too long, a flower pot in the wrong shade of blue. But this was something else entirely. This was war. Ezra's hands curled into fists as he stared at the letter, the words blurring together as rage ignited like wildfire in his chest. He thought about their parents, about the sacrifices they had made to buy this home, about the memories etched into these walls. Karen wanted to erase them. She wanted to take everything they had built and turn it into another victory for her twisted vision of control. Not on his watch. With a sharp inhale, Ezra shoved the letter into his pocket and pushed himself to his feet. His heartbeat was steady now, resolute. "If Karen wants a war," he said, voice low and certain, "then she picked the wrong opponent." Karen had not always lived here. She had arrived years ago, a migrant from a distant land, bringing with her an entitlement that seeped into every action she took. The moment she set foot in the neighborhood, it was as if an invisible storm had begun to brew, a storm that only she controlled, one that spread through whispers, fear, and an ever-tightening grip on power. At first, her presence seemed benign, a woman with a mission to improve the community. She smiled at meetings, spoke eloquently about order and structure, and promised to restore dignity to the neighborhood. But soon, the smiles faded, revealing the iron will behind them. Whispers surrounded her past, how she had built a reputation in other communities, enforcing absurd policies, bending laws, and making life unbearable for those she deemed undesirable. The first signs of trouble were small, almost imperceptible. A note was left on a neighbor's door, demanding they repaint their mailbox. A fine was issued for a garden that was too wild. She started showing up at homes unannounced, clipboard in hand, jotting down infractions that didn't exist until she decided they did. But the more she tightened her grip, the more the neighborhood began to suffocate. It was never about keeping things in order, it was about power. The power that slithered through every rule, every amendment, every new restriction she passed without consulting anyone. She had an uncanny ability to make people feel small, to make them doubt themselves, to convince them they were in the wrong even when they weren't. And when she couldn't do it with words, she did it with fear. The HOA was her weapon, a tool of quiet oppression disguised as structure. With it, she chiseled away at the community, one rule at a time, enforcing policies that seemed designed not to uplift, but to control. And she was good at it, so good that people stopped fighting back. They paid their fines, made their modifications, swallowed their anger, and fell in line. Fear whispered through the streets. If Karen wanted you gone, you would be gone. Families moved. Elderly residents, tired of the constant fines and harassment, sold their homes for less than they were worth just to escape. The neighborhood changed. It became sterile, stripped of its warmth and familiarity, and molded into something Karen deemed acceptable. But here, in this land, she had overstepped. This wasn't just about rules. This was about history, and she wanted to erase it. She had chosen the wrong family to cross. Ezra and his siblings had grown up here. This was their grandfather's land, their father's blood and sweat embedded into the soil. Every tree had a story, and every brick in their home held the weight of generations. It wasn't just a house, it was a legacy. And Karen, with her paper-thin rules and insatiable hunger for control, thought she could take it from them. She had underestimated them. Ezra had spent months trying to fight her through official channels. He had filed complaints, gathered signatures, and even tried reasoning with the board, but Karen's influence stretched deeper than he had imagined. Corrupt officials, backdoor deals, and intimidation tactics had allowed her to seize control, one policy at a time. She had embedded herself into the system, making it almost impossible to remove her. Almost. This wouldn't be won in court, not with Karen pulling the strings behind the scenes. The legal system was just another chessboard for her to manipulate. No, this had to be bigger. A battle fought not with paperwork, but with something stronger. The truth. Karen thrived in secrecy, using intimidation and misinformation to keep her power intact. Ezra and his siblings would not let her operate in the shadows anymore. They would take this battle higher. They would make her known. The storm she had started would be the very thing to consume her. They began gathering evidence. Conversations were recorded, documents unearthed, and testimonies were collected. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up found their voices, emboldened by Ezra's determination. The stories poured in: harassment, coercion, lives disrupted, dreams shattered. The picture of Karen that emerged was not of a dedicated leader, but of a tyrant who had overstepped her bounds one too many times. The final straw came when they uncovered a paper trail, proving that Karen had been falsifying documents to push certain homeowners out, particularly those who resisted her authority. With this evidence in hand, Ezra and his siblings were ready. It was time to expose her. The storm had turned against her, and she had nowhere left to hide. Ezra knew he needed to act fast. Time was slipping through his fingers, and every second counted. His family's future and the integrity of their entire community hung in the balance. He took a deep breath, determination hardening his resolve. He gathered his siblings, Layla and Thabo, his hands gripping theirs tightly. "We're not backing down," he said firmly. "We've come too far to let Karen win." They exchanged solemn nods, knowing that what they were about to do would shake the foundations of their neighborhood. Karen had been a menace for years, but it wasn't just about power. It was about control, a particular kind of control that went beyond enforcing arbitrary HOA rules. It was about who she thought belonged in her neighborhood. Karen had made her views painfully clear through her actions, targeting Black and immigrant families with relentless fines and impossible demands while turning a blind eye to violations from her preferred homeowners. Ezra's family had been one of her main targets, and they knew why. For years, Karen had disguised her racism behind the veneer of enforcing neighborhood standards, but the patterns were undeniable. Families like Ezra's were fined for grass that was an inch too high, for paint that wasn't neighborhood appropriate, for cars parked incorrectly in their driveways. Meanwhile, other families, the ones Karen deemed acceptable, could build unpermitted structures, throw loud parties, and make unapproved modifications without so much as a warning letter. The final straw came when Karen led a campaign to strip Ezra's father's name from the local community center, claiming it was time for a change and that a more fitting name should be chosen. It was an insult not just to Ezra's family, but to the entire community, a blatant erasure of the contributions his father had made. Their first move was going public. They took their story to the media, exposing the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface for years. News anchors, journalists, and bloggers latched onto the scandal, their headlines explosive: HOA corruption exposed, families forced out of their homes, and community fights back against tyrannical HOA president. Television interviews painted a damning portrait of Karen's reign of terror. Tearful homeowners shared stories of unfair fines, forced evictions, and blatant intimidation tactics. Layla spoke passionately about their father's struggles, about how Karen had tried to erase their family's legacy. Thabo revealed the financial strain Karen's unlawful penalties had caused, pushing already struggling families to the brink. But what caught the public's attention the most were the testimonies of Karen's selective enforcement of rules. White homeowners would openly violate policies, keeping unapproved fences, painting their houses bright colors, hosting loud parties, and yet they never received a single fine. Meanwhile, Ezra's family and others like them were buried under penalties for the smallest infractions. The public response was immediate and furious. But Ezra knew media exposure wasn't enough. They needed real action, legal intervention, someone with the power to dismantle Karen's empire for good. That's when they decided to take it one step further. They went straight to the local government, presenting undeniable evidence of Karen's corruption. Paper trails of fraudulent fines, recorded conversations of her threats, testimonies from dozens of wronged homeowners. It was all there, an irrefutable case against her. Officials listened, concerned but hesitant. HOA disputes were often tricky legal matters, wrapped in bureaucracy and red tape. But Ezra wasn't deterred. "We need to go higher," he told his siblings. "We need someone who won't just listen, but act." And so, with no time to waste, they went straight to the governor. Governor Maseko was a man of integrity, someone who had spent his entire career fighting for justice. When he saw the mountain of evidence they placed before him, his expression darkened. He flipped through the documents, watched the videos, and read the heart-wrenching letters from families who had suffered under Karen's rule. "This isn't just corruption," he murmured, his voice laced with anger. "This is an attempt to rewrite history." Governor Maseko wasted no time. Within days, an official investigation was launched. Lawyers, auditors, and law enforcement officers stormed the HOA offices, seizing records and combing through years of hidden fraud. The media frenzy intensified. The once feared Karen was now being publicly scrutinized like never before. And then the dominoes began to fall. One by one, Karen's allies abandoned her, desperate to save themselves. Secret financial dealings surfaced, proving that she had been embezzling funds under the guise of community improvement projects. Homeowners came forward en masse, detailing how she had used intimidation and manipulation to keep them compliant. Even some of the white families, who had once turned a blind eye, began speaking out when they realized the depths of her corruption. The public outcry was deafening. Protests erupted outside the HOA headquarters. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for our homes" and "Karen must go" filled the streets. Social media campaigns demanding her resignation trended nationwide. Karen, once the unshakable force in the neighborhood, found herself cornered, her power slipping away with every passing second. And then the final blow came. After weeks of investigation, legal action was taken. Karen was stripped of her position. The HOA was disbanded entirely, its corruption too deep-rooted to salvage. Families who had lost their homes due to Karen's greed were promised restitution. And Ezra's family? They stood victorious, not just for themselves, but for every homeowner who had ever been wronged. As he stood on his front porch looking out at the community that had banded together to fight for justice, Ezra felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. They had fought against an unjust system, and they had won. Karen's reign was over, and in its place, a new beginning had taken root. The neighborhood would heal, but they would never forget. This was more than a victory. It was a statement. No one, not even a power-hungry, racist HOA president, could erase history or dictate who belonged. This was their home, and they weren't going anywhere. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more shocking real-life battles against injustice. Karen's downfall is proof that no tyrant lasts forever, but the fight against corruption and discrimination is far from over. Imagine waking up one day to find your home and your legacy targeted simply because of who you are. What would you do if someone tried to erase your history? Share your thoughts below and see you next time.